for years, and even now you hear people start sentences with, we are growing and therefore we will need more water. And that is completely understandable and also in most cases becoming an absolutely obsolete supposition.
Hello, and welcome to the Water Buffs podcast. I'm Mitch Tobin, the director of the Water Desk, and I'm really excited to be speaking today to Cynthia Koehler, who is executive director of the Water Now Alliance, which works with water providers to help them meet 21st century challenges to our water systems. Cynthia is an environmental attorney and water policy expert with 20 years of experience working on federal and state water issues and legislation. She was previously the Environmental Defense Fund's legislative director for California water issues and the legal director for Save San Francisco Bay. She's currently serving her fourth term as a board member of the Marin Municipal Water District north of San Francisco. In the interest of full disclosure, I should also note that both Cynthia's organization and the Water Desk receive funding from the Walton Family Foundation, but we as a journalistic enterprise are editorially independent from our funders and from the University of Colorado here in Boulder. And also I previously served as an informal and unpaid advisor to the Water Now Alliance. So with that, I'd like to welcome you to the show, Cynthia. It's really great to have you on.
Thanks, Mitch. Delighted to be here.
Great. Well, maybe for starters, you can just tell us a little bit more about the Water Now Alliance, your mission, and the types of work that you do.
Sure. So Water Now Alliance is a national network of local water decision makers who are supporting climate resilient and more environmentally sustainable water strategies and policies in their communities. So we work across the full spectrum of drinking water, wastewater, and stormwater agencies, and we have about 500 members now in 38 states. And our mission really is to give these leaders the tools, the resources, and the connectivity they need to champion that transition to these more sustainable and 21st century solutions. So that leads us really to our three buckets of work. We do strategic policy advocacy, so we clear away barriers at all levels to local sustainability initiatives. We provide a lot of technical assistance to communities on the ground that just need a little bit more capacity to implement their local climate resilient priorities. And then we do a lot of convening, educating, connecting, webcasts, this kind of thing, to really engage those leaders in the opportunities that are available, the resources, connect them to one another, create peer-to-peer learning opportunities, and connect them to the resources and the innovators that are at the cutting edge.
Interesting. And as we mentioned at the outset, you are also not only serving as the director of the Water Now Alliance, but also working for the Marin Municipal Water District on the board. Tell us a little bit about that job and what it entails.
Sure, that's really my community service. It's not really a job. I'm an elected member of the board, so I'm not on staff. And I think you mentioned I'm in my fourth term, so I'm in my 14th year of doing it, so it's been a while. And that experience really led to my working with some colleagues to launch the Water Now Alliance, because what we realized is, water utility leaders are often somewhat isolated from another. It's a particular group of folks that are on these governing boards. Some of us are special district directors like me, some are city council members or county supervisors, some are appointed. What we all have in common is this governing board responsibility. We're the ones who put our hands in the air and vote on policy, rate increases, and direction. So these are enormously important leaders. About 95% of water infrastructure spending happens at that local level. So these are the leaders that really hold the keys to the nation's water future. In my own experience on my own relatively mid-sized organization, I found that as a board member, you can have a really significant impact. So the work that I've done to advance water use efficiency, for example, in our area has been really effective. We've saved ratepayers millions of dollars. We've reduced energy consumption while still providing an affordable service for our ratepayers. So it can be challenging working at that local level and sometimes thankless, but it's really important work. And I'm really honored to have been able to do it for so long.
Mm-hmm. So you work with a variety of water providers and utilities. and water managers, and would love to hear from you. What are the challenges that they are facing in 2020? What keeps water managers up at night? What are some of the real difficult issues that they're grappling with?
Yeah, well, how much time have you got? No, it's a long list. So one thing that we do at Water Now is we survey not only our members but water utility leaders nationally. We've put together a database of about 8,000, and it's growing constantly. And it's a great question. I'll just hit the top three that we really hear about on a regular basis. The first, honestly, is climate change, and what that means for being not just providing water supplies, but of course dealing also with water quality and wastewater and sanitation and stormwater. Water leaders really are at ground zero for this, water utility managers in particular. Obviously droughts are becoming more frequent and more severe. And at the other end of the spectrum, the same is true for flooding and stormwater discharges and CSOs. So these are all issues that are just becoming exacerbated by the various effects of climate. I'd say the second significant issue is keeping rates affordable, especially for vulnerable communities. Rates are going up, and I think we'll talk more about that. And so that's a challenge, right? There are a lot of things that are coming down the pike, but water and all of its variations are essential resources. So how do you make sure that you're serving all communities equitably is another really significant issue that we hear about. And then increasingly we're hearing about PFAS. I'm not going to even try to attempt what that actually stands for. It's a technical chemical term, but what PFAS really are referring to are synthetic chemicals that we're finding in household products, packaging, medicines, personal care products, even household cleaners and nonstick pots and pans that are increasingly finding their way into our water systems. And the regulatory agencies are really struggling to keep up with those and what that's going to mean for keeping our water supply safe. I'd say those are the main ones that we hear about on a regular basis.
Yeah, you mentioned the issue of affordability and rates, and maybe we can talk a little bit more about that. It seems like many water providers have changed the way that they charge their customers. They've adopted things like tiered rate structures where you pay different amounts per gallon based on how much you use. Tell us a little bit about some of those types of trends, what's motivating and why they're happening.
Right. I think there's a few issues at play. Tiered pricing, which has been with us for a while now, that's really intended to send a price signal. The people using more water are actually putting more strain on the system. Most water providers have different levels, different water from different sources. And they cost different amounts of money. So that last increment, the justification for tiered pricing is that last increment of water that's more expensive, the people who are putting that kind of pressure on the system really should be paying more at the margins. I think the other really interesting thing that we're seeing nationally is a transition from strictly volumetric pricing to an attempt to cover more of our fixed costs. Water is really moving from, and not everybody is there yet, of course, but what we're seeing is a trend that water utilities are moving away from seeing water as a commodity like, tomatoes or sneakers, and really seeing it more of a service. So in that respect, we're about a decade behind where the electrical industry is, but that's definitely where things are going because, the price of water itself, not for everybody, but for most water utilities, is actually your lowest cost. Your fixed costs, in some ways it doesn't really matter whether whether somebody's taking long showers or short showers. I still have to run this whole water system. I've got to be dealing with my water treatment facilities and, keeping up my tanks and my pipes and all the rest of it. So fixed costs as a ballpark are about 80%. So this transition to, really trying to treat water more as a service is definitely a trend that that we're seeing. You do need to send that price signal for sure. So that's the interesting needle that everybody's trying to thread. You want to send that price signal with some kind of tiering, but you've also got to recover your fixed costs. I think the other issue that you alluded to that is really affecting how people are structuring rates is this issue of needing capital to address aging infrastructure. That is, I would say, a fairly universal issue, and it is another part of the reason that we're seeing water utilities turning to more creative forms of pricing and rates to ensure that they've got the resources they need to make sure their citizens are healthy and safe and secure in the future.
Mm-hmm. And it seems like in a lot of different places, we've seen per capita water consumption go down, people conserving water more. But that is the product, in a sense, that they are selling as a water utility. And so is that creating financial stress and problems, even though ultimately that's something we are striving toward?
Yes, so that's a fascinating issue, and it's one that a lot of utilities are, in fact, struggling with. This issue of paying more for less is not just a problem on the financial side, it's actually a political quandary for decision makers. So we at Water Now actually put together an entire workshop and set of briefing materials for utilities on how to communicate with your ratepayers about paying more for less. It's counterintuitive, but it's actually, in most cases, better for you as a consumer and better for the utility. And the reason I say that is because efficiency and reuse are often your cheapest options. So even though you've got this mindset that you're paying more and you're getting less, what you're getting, again, is the service, and you're getting it at a lower cost than you would otherwise have to pay for that utility to go out and find alternative sources of supply, whether that's taking more water out of rivers, building farther, more extensive pipelines, or desal or other types of, very expensive public works projects. So it's really in the utility's best interest and in the ratepayers' best interest to be investing in these conservation and efficiency and reuse methodologies, because they ultimately, not only will they make you more secure, they will ultimately actually save you money. So the issue is in many ways one of changing the mindset and communicating effectively. And again, as we were talking about in response to your prior question, and again, making sure that your rates are structured so the utility maintains its fiscal health and is not relying as much on volumetric sales. That's really the trend we're starting to see. And that is going to be a transition that I think is going to be, very widely replicated, not just in the West, but across the country.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk a little bit about affordability. I mean, water is not a luxury. Everybody needs it in order to survive. And so it seems like the price of water is going up over time. What are some of the issues that people are facing in terms of affordability, and how do water providers deal with that, given that water is essential for life and something that people can't go without?
Yeah, absolutely. So the first thing to note is that water is still incredibly cheap. In most parts of the West, it's less than a penny a gallon. I think we just hit a penny on average here in California. I believe it's less in Colorado. And, in the studies that have been done, researchers have found that for the most part, water bills are among the household's lowest, if not the absolute lowest bill, generally far less than your monthly, gas and electricity bill, far, far less than your mobile phone bills, your cable bills. So as a percentage of household incomes, and you're absolutely right about the essential nature of water, it's still relatively affordable for most people. That said, where we're really seeing the affordability issues really come into play is with vulnerable communities and disadvantaged communities. And that is becoming an increasing challenge for water utilities. We are seeing many of them step up to that. And there's a variety of programs that are being developed now, either bill forgiveness or long-term payment plans or reduced rates. I mean, water is a human right, as you point out. And as far as we are seeing, utilities are really struggling to ensure that their vulnerable and disadvantaged citizens are covered. For example, we've seen a couple of communities where they were seeing a large number of water turnoffs for lack of bill payment, and rather than recognizing that is really not an acceptable outcome, they've started turning to other options. For example, one community in Wyoming put into place a direct installation program for low flow toilets. It was finding that part of the challenge that lower income families were having is that they were using these older, very water inefficient appliances. And so by simply providing them, not expecting them to go out and upfront the money, but by providing them with these more efficient appliances, they were significantly reducing their water consumption, lowering their water bills, and getting them out of the challenges that they were facing financially. So there are a lot of that kind of creative solutions that are underway, but it's an area that needs a lot of work and a lot of attention.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk a little bit about climate change. You mentioned that we're seeing droughts that are getting deeper. On the other end, we're seeing catastrophic floods, greater magnitude. So the hydrologic cycle is really taking a beating in terms of changes from climate change. And I know you work a lot on this issue of resilience in light of climate change. So tell us a little bit more about the challenges posed by climate change and some of the solutions and how we can make these water systems more resilient.
Yeah. So on climate, what we're really seeing is that the change is now. Water providers, regardless of your views politically, we're finding really across the spectrum, are really at ground zero addressing these issues, no matter what verbiage they use to describe it. And the changes in historical precipitation and snowpack, it's all happening now. And so for generations, I'd say one of the most significant issues is that for generations, water providers have looked to the past. They've said, oh, well, here's our, we have these records from 70, 100 years. We know we can predict with some level of confidence, about what the future holds. I think water providers are quickly coming to appreciate that is no longer the case. The past is no longer prologue. And so, planning scenarios, we were seeing people, really scramble, working with research institutions to figure out how to model the future, what we should be providing for. I would say the immediate impacts, as you've already described them, obviously less snowpack, and real changes in the hydrologic pattern. For example, here in California, the rain season is really moving out. We typically, in the past, have seen March 1st as the end of the rainy season. We had no rain in February at all. I think it's the first time in decades that happened. And so those are the kinds of things we're seeing. So part of the way we are dealing with that, we're seeing water utilities deal with that, is more investment in, I would say, local resilience and independence. More investment in on-site reuse, in distributed systems at the, at a localized level for businesses, homes, and institutions, and really a focus on how to make, our communities more secure, given the resources that are currently available. It's sort of the trend that we're seeing, is how can we maximize the efficiency of the resources that are developed in light of the likelihood that that we're seeing changes in the way that precipitation patterns are occurring, and again, especially the decline in snowpack.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and California has certainly experienced some really deep droughts in recent years, and as you mentioned, February, typically one of the rainier months, was just bone dry across so much of the state. You mentioned efficiency, and we hear a lot about water conservation, how important that is. From the perspective of water providers, what works and what doesn't work? It seems like there have actually been a lot of successes in terms of reducing per capita use, and that some cities are using less water even though they're much bigger than they used to be. What are the most successful strategies for conservation, and what actually doesn't work so well?
Sure. And I think the point you made there really bears emphasis. For years, and even now, you hear people start sentences with, we are growing and therefore we will need more water. And that is intuitive, and that is completely understandable, and also in most cases becoming an absolutely obsolete supposition. What we are finding over and over again is that connection between a growing population and water use has been broken. In many places, the growing population is going up and the water use is going down, or even just staying flat. The most dramatic example of that is Los Angeles, which has been booming since, forever, but since the 90s in particular, and its total water consumption has stayed almost flat over that period. And that is due to a variety of investments, but largely in the humble low-flow toilet and other, indoor appliance fixes. There's been relatively little that's occurred actually on the outdoor space, and we can get to that in a minute. So it is a fascinating thing to see, and we see that replicated across Colorado, Arizona, and Utah. So I don't want to say that there's no connection between an increasing population and pressure on demand, but it is no longer the case that those things are necessarily aligned. Growing population is no longer correlated with an increase in water, given how successful we have been in conserving. So in terms of your question about what works, honestly, what works are financial incentives. If the utility begins to see conservation as part of its own infrastructure and therefore worth investing its own ratepayer dollars in, that is one of the biggest issues. People are much more likely to take action if it's not coming entirely out of their pocket. But money is really not enough. You really have to engage your community. You have to treat people as partners, and you need to educate them and bring them into the conversation. And that outreach really has to be compelling, right? What doesn't work, to answer your other question, is scare tactics. That really can turn people off. It can, make them not trust. And I would say that's the other big piece of conservation success, is building a reservoir of trust between the community and its water provider. Citizens are going to step up, they're going to act, they're going to do what they need to do, particularly if they feel that they are being dealt with in good faith and that their water provider is a credible source of information that can be trusted. That's what we're really seeing. During the California drought, we had a tremendous response, with very little adverse impacts to communities, even though the drought was very severe. I mean, agriculture was a whole other thing. We can talk about that. But on the urban side, the cities, businesses, industries, homeowners really stepped up and did a tremendous effort around efficiency that has had long-term impacts. It wasn't just that people were taking shorter showers, it's that they were fundamentally changing their systems, whether it was indoor appliances or changing out turf or, whatever it was. We've seen there hasn't been a bounce back to the higher levels of use. And Colorado had a very similar experience during its last drought. So I would say those things together, the financial incentives, I think are essential, but really need to be nested in a compelling and trustworthy set of communications and narratives coming from the water provider. And I want to give kudos to Denver Water in particular. They've put together a really successful and, really extraordinary communications effort, and I think have built exactly the kind of trusting relationship with most of their consumers that really is the model for water utilities nationally.
This is Water Words, a fast explanation of a bit of water lingo. I'm Hannah-Lee Myers. Today's water word is demand hardening. According to the Alliance for Water Efficiency, demand hardening happens when prior conservation makes future demand reductions harder to achieve. In the context of municipal water use, an example of demand hardening used in a sentence may be something like, some water managers feel demand hardening is most problematic during times of drought if customers have already cut back their water use. So here's a way to get a feel for the concept of demand hardening. Once a water user has changed their habits or used technology to make major water savings over the long term, such as changing their landscaping or finding and fixing leaks, achieving additional water savings during a short-term drought may become more difficult. So when you hear someone talk about demand hardening, they're saying it will be challenging for water use to become more efficient. But others argue demand hardening is a myth, and there's still plenty of low-hanging fruit when it comes to water conservation. Now back to the Water Buffs podcast.
Say a little bit more about this idea of hardened demand.
Sure. Candidly, I think at Water Now here, we think that's a bit of a myth. I mean, maybe on an individual basis, at a very residential level, the way you're describing, you'll get to that point. But from a community perspective, certainly from a statewide perspective, we are nowhere near that point. I mean, there's an enormous amount of potential. We've really barely scratched the surface. Particularly in the West, where you're still seeing gallons of water per person per day in excess of 200 and 300, in some homes. And compared to the many other parts of the world, which is well below 100 in many communities where the where the quality of life is perfectly fine. We're talking about first world countries. So we have a long way to go to get to that kind of demand hardening, and there is an enormous amount of low hanging fruit. There may be, what we're seeing is in cases where utilities have invested for a long time in certain technologies, like low flow toilets are the best example because we've all been doing that for, almost 30, 40 years. At some point you will reach a saturation point, but what we're finding is that every time we think we have, new technology comes along. We used to think 1.6 gallon, per flush toilets were the bee's knees. And, now we're well below that in many places. So it's certainly the case that we're certainly never going to get to zero water use, and we shouldn't be, hoping for that. And, our position at Water Now is that we also don't want to eliminate outdoor landscaping. Outdoor landscaping is a good thing in many ways, especially when we're talking, when we're talking about climate and other issues. However, we have barely scratched the surface in addressing the opportunities to be far more efficient in outdoor landscaping, particularly in the West. So I think we're a long way from demand hardening, and I think the opportunities are still, quite significant.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's talk more about outdoor water use and landscaping, because in a lot of places that's a huge piece of the puzzle. Certainly it is in my house in Denver. Our water use increases dramatically during the months that we have our sprinkler on, even though we've removed a lot of grass. So what are some of the strategies that water providers are pursuing in order to reduce water use outside? And also, you mentioned that it's not necessarily a bad thing to have outdoor landscaping and that there are some benefits.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I would say, be pro landscaping. The question is, what's appropriate landscaping? In Colorado, there's a movement now towards Coloradoscape, which I love that concept. Not all outdoor landscaping is created equal. For those of us who live in semi-arid climates, but came from really wet places like, say, Massachusetts or Florida, trying to recreate those childhood memories in our new arid homes may not be the best option. So that's I'd say the first issue. But yeah, there's lots of benefits to outdoor landscaping, especially trees, shrubs, all of these features of landscaping that are enormously important and provide huge benefits for community, not just in terms of greening and beautification, but in addressing, but they're, obviously carbon collectors and, avoid heat islands. I mean, there's all sorts of reasons to have beautiful outdoor landscaping. That is not synonymous with let's use an enormous amount of water outside. So having the right landscaping, native landscaping, outdoor uses that are compatible with efficient water use is the first step. But then there's also an enormous amount of growing technology to help us use our outdoor watering in far more efficient ways. So, between, there's smart irrigation controllers, there's leak detection devices. Leaks are a huge problem with, especially outdoor landscaping, indoor use as well, but outdoors is where you really see the big leak issues. So there's there's an enormous opportunity to continue to have outdoor landscaping and, this combination of appropriate plants and fauna along with technology to help us, be as efficient as possible.
Mm-hmm. So you often at Water Now Alliance talk about things that are described as distributed water solutions. If you could explain that, that would be great.
Sure. Thanks so much for asking about that. Yes, distributed infrastructure is a big priority of ours. So what we mean by distributed infrastructure is in contrast to centralized, more conventional utility infrastructure, which we certainly need. We need pumps and tanks and treatment facilities and reservoirs. But the opportunity for strategies and practices and technologies that are on site, that are localized and distributed widely across a community to serve those same infrastructure functions is frankly enormous. Not to keep talking about toilets, but that's sort of the original distributed infrastructure, right? If you aggregate low flow toilets across a community, you are basically creating, little mini reservoirs. All of those lesser levels of flushing that happen all day long, they create supply in your, they create storage in your reservoirs. They decrease the need for diversions from rivers and streams. And that's just one small piece. When you add to that the efficiencies that can be captured in other indoor appliances, in commercial, in industrial applications, not to mention, we haven't even talked about outdoor landscaping, the opportunities for these systems that are decentralized is just enormous. And the Pacific Institute has estimated in California alone that distributed systems, water use efficiency systems, could capture between 3 and 5 million acre feet of water. So to give you a sense of scale, Colorado uses right around 5 million acre feet every year. And our biggest reservoir in California, Lake Shasta, holds a total of about 4.5 million. So we're talking about just huge potential. And distributed infrastructure, I would say, is not limited to addressing just water supply functionality. It also has applications in the water quality and in the stormwater capture space as well, and we can talk about that. So one of our objectives with our Tap into Resilience initiative, which is an initiative really aimed at utilities to help them access these solutions, learn about them, and to implement them, is to really get them to include these distributed systems in their planning, their budgeting, their financing for infrastructure broadly. The more we can integrate additional options into our planning, the more we will build that resilience that we've been talking about.
Mm-hmm. And people also use the word or the term green infrastructure. Is that the same thing as distributed infrastructure, or is that somewhat different?
Well, the way I think about green and distributed infrastructure is that you've got your Venn diagrams with a very big overlap. So much of distributed infrastructure is green, and virtually all of green infrastructure is distributed. So green infrastructure is a term that essentially means infrastructure that mimics or uses natural systems to serve infrastructure functions. It refers primarily to things that we use in connection with addressing and managing stormwater. So classic examples of green infrastructure are permeable pavements that capture water and absorb it rather than letting it run off, or green roofs that essentially are planted roofs that, again, don't allow water to just run off of roofs into downspouts, but capture it, store it, hold it, and release it slowly. Bioswales, urban tree forests. There's, sort of a universe of things that are being explored. And again, mainly in eastern cities, but I think we're going to see it more and more in the West, to address this issue of sewer overflows and community flooding. So green infrastructure is really taking off. We're seeing that major cities like Philadelphia, Milwaukee, DC are making enormous investments in green infrastructure alongside their conventional built infrastructure. The relationship between green and distributed is that, again, most green infrastructure is distributed in that way. It is decentralized. We're talking about, installations on, public medians, on private residences, in, campus parks, that kind of thing. Other examples of distributed infrastructure are on-site reuse systems, gray water. It can be as small as, a laundry to landscape system in somebody's home, to a really large, complicated on-site reuse project, for some, enormous campus. We still consider that distributed, because it is a way of using water on site as opposed to taking it out of the centralized system. So that kind of reuse, for example, we're seeing more and more in very dense cities, like San Francisco has made a very significant commitment to not only incentivizing, but actually mandating that some of the new building, because we're having an extraordinary building boom here, incorporate reuse, on-site reuse into their buildings, and that way take off pressure on the centralized system. So water that comes into the building for whatever purpose is then, repurposed to flush toilets or, irrigate landscaping or whatever it is. So there are just, dozens and dozens of applications of distributed systems. Some of those are green in the sense that they, mimic natural systems, and some of them are, are more, they're more about water use efficiency, appliances. Mm-hmm. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, that's great. So most people deal not only with a water provider, but also an energy provider, a utility for electricity or gas or both. And, to some extent they are similar. They're both utilities providing these services, but in a lot of ways they're also different. And so maybe you could just explain, sort of compare and contrast water utilities versus electric utilities or energy companies that also provide gas. how are they similar? How are they different? Do they face similar challenges? Do they pursue similar or different strategies in terms of advancing their mission?
Sure, sure. I mean, as you point out, the ways that they're obviously similar is they're providing essential services that people rely on. They tend to be monopolies. I mean, for the most part, there's exceptions, but you don't really have a lot of choice there. You've got your you've got your providers. I think the ways that one of the things that that they're different is that most water utilities, and of course not all, I think the number is roughly 80%, are public. We certainly have investor-owned water utilities. But most water providers, sanitation providers, stormwater agencies are public agencies. So that comes with a whole set of, transparencies, politics, all the rest of it around how resources are used and how decisions are made. Most energy providers, by contrast, are private. Again, there are, of course, some public agencies. They are regulated in a different way. So whereas most water service providers, they have boards or city councils or, appointed commissions that set rates. Most electrical utilities are regulated by some sort of state enterprise. So those are real differences in the way that the community interacts with those services. I would say the other thing that's very different, and I always find people laugh at me when I point this out, but water has weight. Water has weight in a way that electrons don't. And that means that moving water from one place to another, getting water from where it is to these very individual places, homes, businesses, restaurants, schools, institutions, it's a more complicated thing. And it involves in a completely different set of challenges, right? We have to worry about water quality. We have to worry about public health. We have to worry about, this enormous, very complicated, treatment and distribution system that is very different from the electric grid. So I think those are ways that things are really different. But that said, I do think that there's a lot that we can learn from one another. And in particular, as I was saying earlier, the electrical industry is a bit ahead, I think, of where water is in terms of thinking through the commodity service dichotomy and pricing to make sure that we are keeping rates affordable while still providing those essential services. So I think there's a lot of opportunity for cross-pollination.
Yeah, it's interesting to just compare and contrast them. I mean, you mentioned the weight of water, and water can be stored in a reservoir, whereas electricity, although there is advancements being made in battery technology, electricity is generally not stored on the grid. Likewise, water is distributed system. Right. And water, can be reused. I flush my toilet; it goes down to the sewage treatment plant. It's eventually used by somebody else. Not quite the same as turning on or off your light bulb.
Right, exactly. Yeah, so I think that's right.
Great. So you've mentioned some of the advancements and innovations that people are turning to, and would love to hear some more about that in terms of the technologies that are coming online that can help us be more judicious in our water use and manage our water systems better. What are some of the technological advancements that are helping water providers do their jobs better? Yeah,
I would say there's two big buckets, and other people might slice this differently, but what I'm really excited about is a lot of the consumer-facing technology. We mentioned earlier irrigation control devices. I think those are incredibly cool. Rachio has a cloud-based device, so you can be, on vacation, you can be skiing, and you will get a notification that, you may be overwatering this zone in your garden because, it's raining or whatever, and you can just, with a few punches on your app, you can take care of that. I think that kind of thing is really exciting and is likely to take off. We're seeing similar kind of cloud-based technologies around leak detection, which I think is incredibly important. The industry number for leaks is that it actually consumes about 10% of our supply, which when you think about it is just extraordinary. And a lot of that is on the consumer side. And the challenge in the past has been you really have no way of knowing about leaks. That's the whole thing. They're leaking and you don't know until you get your bill. And since most of us bill on 2-month increments, you could be way down the road before you even have any sense of what's going on. Some of the really cool leak detection apps are letting you know about those in real time. I've actually experienced that myself. So you are not only saving yourself money and hassle, but you are contributing to your community's water supply by addressing those issues sooner. We're also seeing that with the development of that technology, that utilities are stepping up. Utilities used to see those as, well, that's the consumer's problem. And now they're saying, well, you know what, that's actually our problem. We're actually, having to, address this problem of reduced supply and reduced capacity because of these leaks. So you're sort of seeing that the technology is actually, generating that kind of a shift. I think the other piece, the other bucket that I would say is really interesting that tech is bringing to bear is internal utility operations. And that might just sound incredibly boring, but utilities, for the most part, are really, really complicated organisms. And the more that they can be addressing their own internal efficiencies, the more you're going to be able to hold down those costs. That's an indirect way of getting, again, to the affordability issue, but also of creating, efficiencies around water use. So some of the really interesting things that I've been hearing about, for example, we're seeing, there's incredible technology that's coming online now around filtration, for example, to start to address some of the PFAS issues. But also really cool things like turbines, little mini turbines that fit on pipes so that you're actually capturing energy as water is, running through the system, so that you can be feeding energy back into your system instead of losing energy. I'm probably not describing that perfectly, but we're seeing a lot of this kind of systems technology, and also the cloud, cloud-based systems are coming to water utilities as well. And I guess, we can talk more about big data, but we're seeing more and more that the opportunities to know more about our systems is really changing. And I think we're at the very beginning of it, really changing how utilities are managing their operations and becoming, the potential for them to become far more efficient is becoming real.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned big data, and it's hard to think of a sector or industry that has not been affected in this age of big data, as people like to say. Tell us how that's playing out in the water sector.
Sure. So I would start by saying water has always been data rich, right? I mean, we collect incredible amounts of data. Part of that's regulatory. Again, we are all about public health. So we need to know, the quality of our water, what's happening where. We're dealing with organic systems. Water typically is running through, forests and trees and, rivers and streams and, pipes and all of this. So we have to collect a lot of data about that. But it's one thing to have, decades of data on, spreadsheets and, yellowing pieces of paper and files. It's another thing to have it digitized and available. And I think that's an enormous, change that is coming. Different utilities are at different levels, but there's that piece of data. But the other really important piece is, where is our water going? Who's using it? How are they using it? We have estimates about, how people are using water that are fairly general. You mentioned your water use spiking in the summer. So in a very gross way, we talk about summer use and winter use, but big data is going to enable water utilities to be much, much more granular about how their consumers are using water, when, where, how. The other issue that I think is really important for big data is, what's the effectiveness of conservation? We have all of these debates that people find frustrating and even somewhat debilitating, because people's perceptions about the effectiveness of different efficiency measures is sort of based on their perceptions. But the more information we have, if these businesses have adopted these, efficiency measures, if these homes have changed out their turf or are using this and that technology, we can start to actually collect real-time data about the impact of that. We have much, much better grounding for making decisions and recommendations, and where to invest our money in different technologies and different practices, so that we can be as effective as possible in maximizing our efficiency. So I'll just tell you a quick story about big data that I just think it's really a harbinger of where we're going. The Molten Miguel Water District in Southern California serves about 100, not 100, what am I saying? About 100,000 folks in Orange County. And they were looking at a very significant investment. I think it was 25 million or so, in a new storage reservoir, because they were struggling with peak demand issues. And before they went ahead with that, they partnered with with Netflix, actually, and Facebook, had a project to bring, data analytics to utility management. And what they found is that they did not actually have a water supply problem. They had a peak demand problem, and that they did not need to spend that money. What they really needed was to talk to their biggest water users, which in that particular locality was golf courses. And simply by changing the timing of when those golf courses were watering, they literally eliminated their entire peak demand issue, and they saved their ratepayers millions of dollars. So it's a fairly small example, but I think a very compelling one of the kind of big data application that we're going to start seeing in the water space.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it seems like a really powerful example in showing how you can save a lot of money just by understanding how water is being used, much better than we have. Well, this has been really super interesting. Is there anything else that you want to add, Cynthia, about some of the challenges that water providers are facing and some of the solutions that they're pursuing?
Well, if we haven't talked too much about distributed systems, I'll maybe end with a plug for our Tap into Resilience initiative. So that really is an effort to help utilities expand their portfolio of solutions. To get back to climate change, the more options that utilities have, whether you're a water provider or you're dealing with sanitation or stormwater, the more options you have, the more resilient you're going to be. It's all about growing the portfolio. And so what Tap into Resilience is, first we have a dedicated website that really explains what those options are, but we've found it's really not enough to just say, here, now go do this. So what we've tried to do with Tap into Resilience is actually walk you through step by step. So what we have is a toolkit that really walks through, because they are different, right? You're going to finance consumer-facing solutions a little bit differently than you're going to finance, building a new reservoir or a new treatment facility. So we walk through those issues. There's tax issues, accounting issues, legal issues, and we've got answers to all of that. The other great thing that Tap into Resilience is bringing to the utility space is we've got about 24 experts in all of these different areas that have signed up with us to provide a certain amount of pro bono time every month. So if you're a utility and you have a question and you're thinking, well, I can read all this stuff on this website, but I'm still not sure how that applies to me, you can fill out a 2-second form and we will connect you with one of those experts, and they will provide you with, they'll have a direct conversation with you about your situation and try to answer your question. And we'll try to get you the resources we need, that you need. So we're really excited about that. The other element of Tap into Resilience is that we are working directly with utilities to provide our own capacity and our own expertise. If you've got initiatives that you want to get going on, but you may not have all the expertise you need on staff, you may have the expertise, but just not have the time. So we are making ourselves available as that resource to help you, to help utilities, move forward in that direction. And there's a bunch of other things, but I hope you'll all your listeners will all have a chance to check out that Tap into Resilience website and help us grow it and make it even better. Oh, I should mention the other thing on the website, because we do hear about this from utilities all the time, is we are collecting case studies. So our team has put together a couple dozen case studies about these kinds of distributed solutions around the country, where they're working, what the results have been. And so we're always looking for people to add to that. If your listeners have great stories or if they want to hear more, we hope they'll be in touch, because we see that as a growing, evolving resource.
Great. Well, I hope folks check it out. It's really important work that you're doing, and really appreciate you coming on the show and telling us about it. So thank you very much, Cynthia.
Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity, and great luck with the Water Desk.
Yeah, thanks very much.
All right. Take care.
Thanks. Thanks for tuning in to the Water Buffs podcast, available in audio and video formats on most major media platforms. Water Buffs is a production of the Water Desk, an independent journalism initiative based at the University of Colorado Boulder's Center for Environmental Journalism. You can learn more about us and about water issues at waterdesk.org. We're also on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. If you have a comment or have a question, please feel free to email us at waterdesk@colorado.edu. Special thanks to the executive producer and co-manager, Hannah Lee Myers, and to our graphic designer and co-developer, Jeff McGee. Be sure to check out our other episodes, and until next time, thanks for tuning in.